Well, we want to welcome you all back again for another live stream with Danny and myself. Oops, I got Richard up there right now. Sorry about that, Richard. I'm going to take you out for a minute. With Danny and myself as we continuing our conversation on the conflict in Israel and Gaza. Welcome, Danny. Good to see you this morning.
Good to be back.
Looking
forward to it.
We've been continuing our discussion on the Israel-Gaza conflict and what's going on and how the church should respond. You know, when we did a lot of live streams at the very beginning of this, Danny, back in November and November of 2023, it gained a lot of attention in the first few weeks and in the months even after the terrorist attack of October 7th. Unfortunately, as things have continued to progress, national attention seems to have waned. Israel and the Palestinians, as many of you may know, have been in conflict for more than a century. If you're interested in learning about the historical context and understanding the present issues as well, we did a 6-part, maybe 30 to 45 minutes per episode series titled Introduction to Israel-Palestine Conflict. You can view that on the Determined Truth YouTube channel under the playlist Introduction to Israel-Palestine. But the conflict, of course, took another direction, maybe an added dimension on October 7th, 2023, when Hamas terrorist forces breached the Iron Wall, killing 1,139 Israelis, 766 of them were civilians, and capturing over 240 hostages. Israel's response, as we expected, was swift and decisive. To date, 39,400 Gazans have been killed, 90,000 or so estimated to be injured in Gaza. More than 10,000 or more are estimated as missing and presumed dead under the rubble. The IDF has reported 716 soldiers have been killed, but this figure is likely much higher in reality than the actual count. In addition, you may not be aware, but 60,000 Israelis in the northern part of the country have been internally displaced due to the concerns of Hezbollah rockets coming in from Lebanon. And we could go on with much more of the details, and we'll continue to do this and probably prevent more details. We are planning another live stream for the week of August 19th. I'll have more details about that soon. You may know that in the recent days, the polio virus has been discovered in 6 out of 7 routine sewage samples, and the fears of an outbreak of polio in the Gaza Strip are high. Internationally, there's been a tremendous rise in anti-Semitism, and that's our concern for today. We want to discuss what's been happening with anti-Semitism, what's happening around the world, what's been going on even before October 7th, and how October 7th has contributed to it, and the plight of Jews around the world. We've been advocating from the beginning that this war is not good for anyone, and that a just peace must be brokered, the hostages must be released, and that a long-term solution must be found for the sake of everyone. We've also challenged you from the beginning of these episodes to find Jewish and Palestinian neighbors in your communities and just meet them, hear their stories, get to know them. Don't let this conflict be something that you only know about by Twitter feeds or news sources or an occasional live stream, but hear their stories and what they're going through and understand the complexity of the situation from their perspective. The war on Gaza, Israel's security concerns, anti-Semitism, they're all intricately connected. And there's no question that opportunists have jumped on the waves of criticism towards Israel and their response to October 7th to increase their violence against Jews globally. So today, we're going to bring back 2 Jewish voices to hear their stories, to learn more about the rise of anti-Semitism in their communities, and really to ask how we might go about criticizing Israel and its efforts in Gaza in a way that doesn't lead to anti-Semitism, and is that even possible? Is there such a way to do that, or are all criticisms of Israel ultimately problematic? So we want to welcome back Richard Harvey and Rabbi Joshua. Richard became a Jewish believer of Jesus in 1974, studied theology at Bristol University. He pioneered the London Messianic Congregation, where he met his wife, Monica, who was also a Jewish disciple of Yeshua. They have 2 children and 3 grandchildren. Richard serves with the church's ministry among the Jewish people. CMJ was a director of Jews for Jesus in the UK and is presently a senior researcher. He was the academic dean and director of postgraduate studies at All Nations Christian College, where he continues to teach Hebrew and Jewish studies. His PhD is published as Mapping Messianic Jewish Theology, a Constructive Approach. So good evening, Richard, as you join us in the evening here in London. Thank you.
Hi, good evening.
All right. And Rabbi Joshua, thank you for being with us, Rabbi Joshua, as well. He's also a Jewish follower of Jesus. He serves as a senior rabbi of Simchat Yisrael.
Simchat.
Yeah. All right. I tried.
Joy of Israel in Hebrew.
Okay. I even Googled earlier, how do you pronounce this word? And I still messed it up. So sorry about that. In West Haven, Connecticut, he's the president of Messianic Jewish Rabbinical Council and adjunct faculty at Messianic Jewish Theological Institute. and King's University. He's currently completing a doctorate at the Spertus Institute for Jewish Learning and Leadership, where his dissertation focuses on protest theology and Midrash on Psalm. He's the author of 2 biblical commentaries and numerous articles. Again, thank you, Rabbi Joshua, for joining us today.
Yes, guys, we're so glad you're back with us. And we just want to start by saying how in your particular communities have things changed since October 7th? In what ways can you give us some examples of how anti-Semitism has your people have experienced that in your community? So what's changed for your particular faith community since October 7th? And whoever wants to go first can just jump in.
Richard, you want to jump in?
Yeah, sure. And also, let me say thank you, Rob, for inviting us back on the program.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you for really wanting to have this conversation, and really appreciate that, because it's not an easy conversation.
Right. Yeah.
And I should just make clear, I'm Jewish, I'm British, I'm sort of German Jewish background. My family are Holocaust survivors. I'm a Jewish disciple of Jesus, so I'm sort of in, but I'm also not seen as fully kosher. But just as I was checking my Facebook feed before I came in to log on today, a friend of mine had posted a terrible picture. I don't know if you've seen it. I send it to you, or if you can show it. And it's just a very anti-Semitic slogan with the Nazi swastika, and it just says "Kill Jews." And the shocking thing about this was posted 17 hours ago in a nice English region called Sutton Coldfield, which is outside the industrial area of Birmingham. It's about 100,000 people live in it. It's a mainly white area. You might even say it's a nominal Christian area. There's about 3,000 Muslims. There's about 120 Jewish people. So why are people posting anti-Semitic slogans with swastikas in a nice English car park? And my friend Wendy Scott, who took the picture, she's a Jewish disciple of Yeshua. She leads a messianic group there. She's sickened, outraged, shocked, frightened. You could say this is designed to incite fear. And this is a classic example of the increase of anti-Semitic incidents that have occurred in the UK since October the 7th. And of course, this is hatred, this is hate crimes. Now, how do you separate that from criticism of the state of Israel, when, in my guess, this is a direct result of the most recent events, the Houthis and Lebanon and what's happening right now in Israel? But nobody's making that distinction between Jews who live in the UK and Jews who live in Israel. And I would love to, as an academic, be able to separate some of the political and the social and the religious factors. But here is somebody who's just saying, kill Jews. Doesn't matter who they are, where they are, what their view of Israeli politics is. That is what we're feeling. And in the Jewish Chronicle, the main Jewish press in the UK, always the first half of the paper is about what's happening in Israel and also responses to anti-Semitism. And they give the results of a survey just come out this week. 80% of European Jewish leaders feel less safe post October 7th. They don't want to wear a yarmulke, a Jewish head covering in public. They don't want to wear a Star of David visibly. And it also says, and this is why this conversation is so hard, that most of these Jewish leaders, European Jewish leaders, find that they have gravitated to their own community and they don't feel safe and secure with outsiders. And this is leaders of Jewish communities throughout Europe. So what is happening, and this is such a sort of traumatic scale that you can only really think of pre-war Nazi Germany and the build-up to the Holocaust, the final solution, is that many Jewish people in the diaspora, and I'm this side of the pond, not your side, are feeling great fear, and they don't really know who their friends are. And of course, when you start wanting a serious political discussion, we don't really hear that with just a sort of analytical, academically distanced way. We feel personally attacked as much as our people. Now, I don't agree with everything that's happening, and there's plenty of room for discussion, but it tends to be an in-house discussion rather than where you're speaking to everybody in a what's seen as a toxic environment.
Wow. You know, Rich, Rabbi Joshua, you're in the States on the other side of the pond. So how are you experiencing that in your community?
So, I mean, unfortunately, the picture that Richard showed is just one of the daily experiences of Jews around the world right now. I mean, just over the weekend in Toronto, there were Jewish businesses that were torched and vandalized. This is now a regular occurrence at whether it's Los Angeles or any other city or small town. I don't think Christians understand that even before October 7th, you cannot pray in a synagogue without going through security. That's just the way that it is, you know. And I understand some mega churches have some kind of security, but, you know, it's not unusual in order to pray even before October 7th to have to go through metal detectors and stuff. People just hate Jews, unfortunately. And since October 7th, this has increased drastically. It's even higher in Europe, but at least in the United States, since October 7th, anti-Semitism is up 300% on college campuses. Depending on the campus, it's up from 400% to over 1,000%. And the challenge is there's not that complex discussion on here. Everybody wants to demonize Israel or not have a complicated conversation about this. And so what is happening is people, which often happens when, you know, you have language like the China virus or the Zionist entity or whatever, people just target whole people groups. You know, so the same thing happened with COVID is people are attacking people of Asian descent. People are attacking, you know, those who are Jewish and of Jewish descent. This is a regular occurrence, and it's being praised, especially on college campuses right now. Like the language is just really atrocious. And so it's leading to just a dramatic increase. And I don't just mean, you know, people are saying mean things on the internet and stuff like this. We're talking about people being beat up, people who have been killed, businesses that are being not just doxxed in the sense of encouraging people not to go to it, like a falafel house that's here locally, just a little falafel stand because the person is Israeli. People have posted all kinds of nasty things on the internet. And, you know, this is people don't realize this is a common occurrence right now. And I think the challenge for us, especially even as Jewish believers in Jesus, is we see very little coming out of the church to speak against this, right? You know, yes, you have some figures like John Hagee or whatever who are, you know, they're very, you know, super pro-Israel position, but you don't have to be supportive of Israel as a political entity and maybe its actions in Gaza in order to speak out against anti-Semitism, which is wrong either way you put it. You know, again, Jesus was Jewish. All the earliest disciples were Jewish, right? So if you hate Jews, you really do hate Jesus.
You know, you mentioned the college campuses because, you know, for a while there, it was in the news every day. Columbia, UCLA, other places around it. You see very little coverage of college campus stuff, but you say it's still going on pretty regularly all over the place with the college campus stuff.
I think one of the good things that have happened with all of those, the protests that were happening on college campuses is it's now summertime on most college campuses. And even though they're offering classes and stuff, you don't have as much of a student presence during the summer. And so that's really affected. Not that there isn't still issues on college campuses, but I think come the fall and depending on what happens in the situation in the Middle East, you know, we could see just again an upsurge in that kind of violence and protesting and stuff. Sadly, you know, there are peaceful protests, but there's been lots of situations where it's been just pure vandalism, you know, harassment of Jewish students, following them around, and you know, some students have been beaten up. It's really been a problem of taking whole buildings, right? Not just vandalizing the buildings, but then holding the buildings themselves. You know, without letting people in or out or whatever. Like this is a huge problem. And I think that it's important to talk about right ways and wrong ways, to both protest and to voice your opinion, whether it's about Israel or anything else. I mean, when it comes
that's
to
a little bit of what we want to kind of get to here in this conversation as well. And we thank you guys so much for doing that and knowing the deep pain from which you guys are coming from and how difficult it is to have this conversation. We appreciate it very much. So thank you. So, and again, I know, Richard and I have talked a number of times online over the last month or more. And I know you've been deeply wounded, both of you. And I can't empathize because I've never been in your situation. I can sympathize a little bit, and we do express our greatest sympathies to you and what have you. So one of the things I've said from the beginning, as I mentioned in the monologue at the beginning, was, we've been telling people, hey, go meet Jewish people, go meet Israelis, go meet Palestinians, go meet Arabs, go meet Muslims, go meet Jews, go meet Messianic, whatever it might be, and hear their stories. So what are some things that you think would be helpful for us to know to better understand our Jewish neighbors, especially, like prior to October 7th, but especially like since October 7th, because I'm imagining that you've been triggered, and that trigger is going to be like, it doesn't take much to light the torch again now, right? Because so kind of speak to us a little bit about that if you can.
Yeah, well, just from my own experience, we're all going through trauma. I landed in Israel on October the 7th and had to get down on the tarmac at Ben Gurion because the rockets were going off overhead. Thankfully, we were safe. But and I'm not an Israeli, but all Israelis and many Jewish people are going through a sort of mental trauma right now, which is leading to some post-traumatic stress, to everything looks normal on the outside, but underneath everybody is anxious, worried, concerned for their family. Everybody knows people who've lost their lives. So one of the questions for your viewers and your listeners is what is my aim in reaching out to my Jewish community or my Jewish friends? And I think the first aim has to be, Rob, what you said, which is to try to develop empathy, to try to actually listen and to try and hear not just the arguments, but to hear the pain. And then I know, because I'm regular at my cousin's synagogue, it's a large Reform synagogue in London, any visitors who will take the time and trouble to come and visit and show solidarity, as Rabbi Joshua said, they have to go through the security like everyone else. That's normal. It's not because people aren't welcome, it's because they want to make sure there's no bomb being brought in. But anybody who's willing to just go and ring up the synagogue and say, I'd love to just come and share, how you do things and to show my love. I mean, that's very unusual for us. It's the minority of people that will take the time and make the actual physical effort to do something. We're coming up to Tish B'Av, one of the most mournful days of the Jewish calendar, the destruction of the temple several times over. My synagogue will be having services which are not just of repentance and remembrance, but also looking at the tragedies that are going on right now and how we indulge in the mourning process, not just for us and for others. So if the sort of conversation that your viewers are wanting to have is to just understand and sit with Jewish people, there are actually many ways to do that. I don't think, I have to be honest here, that the political voices that we hear so stridently are really engaged in that sort of discussion. And of course, some people will have a much more political aim of trying to stop the war in Gaza. And, may God have mercy on us all. May that war be concluded very quickly. But that's not really the appropriate sort of soundbite to come out with when you're meeting Jewish people for the first time. You have to do that on the basis of a relationship and on the basis of hearing how people are feeling.
I would add too, because your question was specifically, what do you want people to know? The biggest thing is that the Jewish community, like any other community, is not monolithic in the sense of not their faith in God, but in the sense of their relationship to the state of Israel, like even their familiarity with what's going on. Most Jews outside of Israel are like any other people group in which you have, most Jews have never, at least in the American context, in the United States, have never been to Israel, right? They might have some family there or whatever, but a lot of them don't keep up on what's really happening. They're being forced to, just because everybody else won't let them not know what's going on right around them. And so, yes, obviously there are people who are much more engaged in everything, but it's very monolithic. And especially outside of Israel, you're going to find that most Jews are critical to some degree of what's, at least of, the current administration in certain aspects of the war. So that's why it's so ridiculous that everybody is, this demonization of Jews all over the world and holding all Jews accountable for the acts of a particular government. We don't do that with anybody else, even though it always happens, no matter any tragedy, as I mentioned earlier. Whether it was with the coronavirus and the attacks on the Asian community, stuff that's happening right now against the Jewish community, like so on and so forth. Like with the war in Ukraine, there was issues, and hatred directed towards those of Russian descent. Mm-hmm. So this always happens. And yet every time we're always saying that it shouldn't happen, but there needs to be more voices speaking out against it. And unfortunately, I feel a lot of the language and the rhetoric is only fueling it rather than calming things down, because all the language is very loaded. The way that things are presented in the media and so on and so forth is, it's not helping the situation, it's hurting the situation. And like you said, for both Israelis, for Jews around the world, and also for Palestinians, right? Nobody benefits by keeping this cycle of violence and the rhetoric going.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You kind of touched on this, but follow up a little bit with, so what are those of us outside your communities? How can we better understand Judaism? You've touched on it already about the diversity within the communities, but things like Zionism, things like I think most of us, far too many of us outside your communities, when we get engaged in this, we're actually very uninformed about things like Judaism, Zionism, even the nation state of Israel. And so I think one of the reasons it's so easy for people to get sucked into this sort of generalization is their lack of knowledge about that. So is there anything you can help us understand from your perspectives on some of these basic characteristics of Judaism, Zionism, the state of Israel, all those kind of things that can help us be better at sorting through all this?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, I would add that it's really important to, about any topic whatsoever, whenever we catch ourselves really kind of demonizing anything to the degree that it's, solely evil or solely bad or whatever. And I know it's easy to do this with especially political rhetoric or whatever. Sure. We need to stop ourselves and think about the fact that this is probably more complicated than I realize, right? And to I think, number one, it's really important for Christians to understand the Jewish context of their own faith, right? What we know as Christianity grew out of a Jewish movement in which, as I mentioned earlier, Jesus was Jewish. All of the earliest followers were Jewish. For the, first century or so, it was known as Haderech, the way, right? That's what the earliest followers of Yeshua, of Jesus, called themselves. They didn't call themselves Christians. According to a couple verses in the book of Acts, tells us that the term Christian was a term that was applied to these followers, Jewish followers of Jesus, and it stuck, right? And now it's the term that everybody knows, but it wasn't the original term for this Jewish movement of followers of Jesus. And I'm not saying everybody now needs to convert to Judaism or anything like that, but I think, just an appreciation for understanding that the Christian relationship to Judaism, the Jewish people, is going to be different than from any other faith community, right? So that's a big one. I think also understanding the complexities of both the situation with Israel and with the Palestinians. Again, a lot of the language that happens, especially in the Christian community, is either this, Christian Zionism that is so far one direction that there's no room for any criticism of Israel. And then on the complete, flip side, if you dare say anything positive about Israel, right? And again, just a couple more points, and I'll let Richard pipe in here with his thoughts. Is another thing that I wish people understood, is that also Israelis are not monolithic in the sense of like all believe and support one thing. That prior to October 7th, people might have remembered from the news that there were, tens of thousands, even at times, tens of thousands of Jews marching in the streets against attempts at this current administration to reform the justice system, and especially the Supreme Court, right? And there's still a lot of protesting, not to the same degree, because there's different level of concerns for just general safety and stuff right now, but there's still a lot of sentiment and protesting against the current administration and the way that they're handling the war in Gaza. And so again, I think it's really important that we understand, and we can't demonize an entire group of people. Also just the complexity of Israel itself. It's easy to throw around monikers of like apartheid and all this kind of stuff. And again, I'm not saying there's not room for legitimate criticism. I have plenty of my own, but again, people don't realize that there are 2 million Israeli Arabs, right? The situation of the Palestinians is one only piece of a complicated puzzle, because there are also 2 million Arabs within the land of Israel, who, although, might face issues of discrimination and stuff, but they're fully incorporated into society, serve as doctors and lawyers. A chief justice is an Arab Muslim, and was even responsible for sending to prison a previous prime minister and a president. Like, that wouldn't happen in an apartheid system, right? The 2 languages of the state of Israel are Hebrew and Arabic. And they're not just Jews and Arabs in Israel. Like, sadly, over the weekend, there were
the Druze
the Druze community, which is an Arabic-speaking community that traces itself to descendants of Jethro, for those who know the Bible, who was Moses's father-in-law. They are a non-Muslim sect, but they're an Abrahamic faith that's not Judaism, Christianity, or Islam. They're a different Abrahamic faith. And there are plenty of other minorities. There are actually a lot of minorities in Israel that people don't realize. And so it's a community that, yes, has its problems like anywhere else, but people live and work together. When you go to the markets in Israel, the open air markets, you'll have a stand where, the person running it is Druze, and the next one is an Orthodox Jew, and then the next one over is maybe an Arab Christian or an Arab Muslim. You know what I mean? It's really this diverse world that people don't know about. And if you only understand the complications, then it's, without understanding these complications, it's easy to demonize things. Let me just say one more, and that's the demonization of the idea of Zionism. Again, not that there isn't room for criticism, especially of certain ideals within Zionism, but the term Zionism has now just become loaded for occupation or whatever, apartheid or whatever. And the term Zionism is simply just the belief that Jews have the right to exist in their own ancient homeland, just as any other people group do, whether that's Palestinians or anybody else, right? Now, in any kind of idea, you can have more nationalistic, approaches. You can have more progressive and liberal approaches. Most Jews around the world would consider themselves in some sense of a Zionist, in the sense of like, Jews have the right to exist in our ancient homeland, just like other people do, without necessarily holding on to radical versions of that. So anyway, I'll let Richard jump in now.
Yeah. No, I agree, Rabbi Joshua. I mean, we both teach in different courses to help Jews, Christians to understand the riches of the Jewish heritage, Jewish spirituality, Jewish history. But in a way, we are like the guinea pigs, or we're the objects under the microscope. And I think, especially for Christians, there's something about the the filters that Christians have, and maybe even my friends in North America particularly, which makes it actually very difficult to really come to terms with knowing, understanding, and dare I say, loving and praying for Jewish people. So, Rob, I love what the sort of strapline on your channel is about the church and understanding scripture and the role of the church in the 21st century. We wrestle with the kingdom of God, the mission of God's people, and how this applies to the church in the 21st century. I think one of the vital parts of that mission is actually seeing how the church and Israel are inextricably linked, both through the sad history of persecution and separation, but even more fundamentally in the purposes of God and his purposes for all creation. And rightly understood, the church that we are part of the body of Messiah is really the extension to the nations of what God has chosen to do within Israel, because the Commonwealth of Israel is now extended to all the nations. This is Ephesians 2, because of the death and resurrection of our Messiah Yeshua. So there's a very personal reason for Christians to want to understand Jewish people, their concerns better. And I often think, there's 2.4 billion people who call themselves Christians in the world today. 40 million or so, I don't know how you define them, evangelicals in the USA. And yet there's probably only maybe 40 million Jewish people, depends on how you count them. And of Jewish believers in Yeshua, maybe I reckon about 150,000 who are self-identifying. So there's a great asymmetry here. It's like an elephant looking at an ant. But an ant and an elephant actually are both, part of the created order. And Jews who believe in Jesus are even smaller than the ant. We're like the water flea, but we purify the water and provide the ecosystem for the ant and the elephant. So your listeners and your viewers, if they really want to understand, are going to have to see their own filters and assumptions, and then, like every good disciple, to find a way to study and learn and to do things in practice as well as in theory. So just to have Jewish friends, which is a big ask, as there's so many who don't have Jewish friends.
Right.
Empathy, as you said, it's a really hard thing to cultivate, but you can do that. Simon Sharma's series on Jewish history, so many other educational programs that give you an insight into Jewish life. And then you begin to deal with the realities and not just the fictions or the rhetoric that's going around.
Yeah. Thank you so much, guys. And again, we want to thank you guys for being with us today. Determined Truth is a 501c3 nonprofit. We are trying to challenge the church to be the church. And I think, Richard, your comments were really well spoken. But one of the problems I think that I see, and I think Danny probably shares this with me, is the fact that the church in America has become so immersed with the American ethos that it's hard to separate the political ethos from the kingdom that we're called to, and we have this spiritual, secular, sacred divide that just complicates things as well. And so I think we should see everything binary. And Rabbi Joshua mentioned earlier that some are either so pro Zion or so radically anti-Zion. The problem with that a little bit, Joshua, is that the voices in the middle don't get heard because the media doesn't. Sex sells, right? War sells, conflict sells. So the media is going to get the kind of get the radical out there as well. So hey, let me kind of turn this, and I'm going to ask you a difficult question, and I respect however you want to answer this question a little bit. But this is really kind of from me saying like, hey, help me know how to go forward with these conversations. As you know, I've been having a bunch of conversations. But one of the thoughts is that the response to October 7th, right? The Israeli response, and Netanyahu and Ben-Gvir, and I know you don't necessarily affirm the radical far right, Ben-Gvir, Smotrich, and them leadership, but that their response is actually making anti-Semitism worse, or giving a pretense, at least, for people to use for anti-Semitism. You mentioned earlier that 80% of Jewish leaders in Europe feel less safe today. Do you think some of that could be contributed to either, you can say it this one of two ways, either Israel's actions themselves, or at least the perception of Israel's actions, Netanyahu in particular, and the I won't say warmongering, that might be an overstatement, but what do you think of that?
Yeah, I'll just jump in. I think it's a false analogy, because it makes an assumption that if Jews do something bad, anti-Semitism justifiably gets worse.
Right. Yeah, I'm not asking justifiably. I'm just asking, is it getting worse?
Yeah, and so even if it was correct that the war in Gaza is not being fought in terms of the Geneva Convention or the International Court of Human Rights or whatever, and by the way, I believe in a just war and a just peace, and conflict needs to be reconciled, and there has to be restorative justice. So sooner or later, people are going to be held to account for everything that happens. But the moral equivalence argument that sort of seems to assume that if Jews do something bad, that's because that justifies an increase in anti-Semitism, I think is an unhelpful way of thinking.
I'm wondering if I'm being misunderstood a little bit, Richard. I apologize for interrupting, because I'm not asking if it's justifiable. I'm just asking, is that one of the reasons why there has been an uptick in anti-Semitism? I'm not asking justifiably.
I think it's an excuse. I think it's an excuse for increased anti-Semitism.
Exactly. So has anti-Semitism increased since October 7th?
Absolutely, and it's not just anecdotal. That empirical evidence supports the idea, as I mentioned, that at least in the United States, it's over 300%. Right. It's even higher on college campuses, depending on which campus, anywhere from 400% to over 1,000%. There are segments within certain campuses that become completely hostile to Jews, and they're not. It's been very clear they're not welcome in those institutions. There are lawsuits against whether it's Harvard Divinity School or others for they're just outward hostility towards Jewish students and faculty and staff. So this isn't just like anecdotal. The Jews feel like everybody hates them. There's actual evidence and statistics to support this.
So let me ask a follow-up question then, and again, this goes back to what I prefaced the last question with, and that is, how then what are some things that you would say, hey, Rob, okay, this is okay, this is not okay, to say, if I'm saying this war needs to stop, this is not good, we got to stop this, we got to find a just solution, a peaceful solution. I understand Israel was attacked, I get that, self-defense, I get all those arguments, but violence is not the way to go about solving, and it's only going to make things worse. At what point would you say, Rob, you shouldn't go there, or because this is also leading to more anti-Semitism around the world as well. Our Jewish brothers and sisters, whether they're in Christ or not in Christ, are suffering even more greatly. We need to stop this. At what point, Richard, in particular, because you and I think we've had some online conversations about that, would you say, you just can't go there, or well, if you do go there this way? You understand what I'm asking, Richard? Or?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think, Rob, you're in an interesting position because you're a broadcaster and a communicator, and you're trying to put across a message which is consistent with what it means to be in the mission of God and how we play our role. I think your comments on calling for justice and for peace and for reconciliation, absolutely. But when you begin to we are to some extent all external to the conflict that's happening right now. Right. And we're taking views and positions. We're stakeholders or we're advocates for one view or another. I think that the sort of rhetoric becomes so polemical and adversarial that we achieve nothing by judging one side or the other as if there was a moral equivalency. For me, the increase of anti-Semitic activity, which is legally prosecutable, has vastly increased. But the phenomenon of anti-Semitism, which has been latent throughout the centuries, the millennium, and is actually very hard to really define. There are different ways of trying to define it. That has been there for ever since. There's a long history. And actually, all you can really do is measure events and incidents and then say that they're legally wrong. So I think there's a confusion here. And I hear it, I don't know if Rabbi Joshua hears it as well, between, if you like, political anti-Semitism, criticism of Zionism in Israel, criticism of the particular conduct of a war. And of course, all wars are terrible things, but they're sadly very common. It's the continuation of politics by other means. So I think you have to be very careful and measured in your criticism. And yes, you and I have had a few extra discussions, and I've sent you several examples of internal voices in Israel who are strongly critical of the conduct of the war and the conduct of the government. But when it's said in an outside world, it's like an echo chamber where it reverberates. There's no positive action that results from it, except a lot of hot air.
Yeah, and I would, and we discussed this briefly a little bit the last time that you were on, a little bit, if I can go tangential for just a second, and that is what I see the role of myself speaking up, and Danny can speak for himself here if he wishes to, is the fact that the American evangelical church is so wed to this issue in particular, especially the political side of it, that you know, I personally think that American political individuals, Biden and others, have to and should be brought before the court of justice at some point in time for you know, supporting this. That's my American responsibility and my Christian responsibility to say, hey, we can't. Not my tax dollars. Don't use my tax dollars to do this. Let's see if we, as well as the fact that this is not good for Israel or the Palestinians anyway. So let's stop this for everyone's sake. So I think that there's this necessity as an American Christian to speak up somehow. But then I run into the issue of, okay, now it becomes the potentiality for anti-Semitism and all the complexities. And that's why I'm speaking. That's why I'm asking the question. I think you understand. So, yeah.
I mean, I'd just like to comment because I think a lot of this is, again, the conversation itself is fueling the anti-Semitism. And we've talked about before how, you know, what does legitimate criticism of the state of Israel look like, right? One is that it's one thing to criticize policies, administrations, you know, decisions of individuals. But to, you know, there's a great article. I was looking at a few, but one is, what does criticism of Israel become anti-Semitism? This is by an institution called Echoes and Reflections, teaching, you know, and there's others you can find out there, but they give three things, which is when it crosses legitimate criticism into anti-Semitism. One is demonization. The second is double standards. And the third is delegitimization, right? And I think the challenge here, even in some of the things that you just said, Rob, is it's a double standard because you're trying to hold Israel accountable to something that you're not expecting anybody else to hold to the same standard, right? And I don't know, and so please correct me. Did you ever have a conversation like this regarding the war between Russia and Ukraine? Like, what I'm saying is, like,
yes,
I have.
So there's.
I've been very
I'm glad to hear that, because
I've been very critical of this war because I think
only focus on the war between Israel and Gaza. You know, even the way that you threw out a number like 37,000, you didn't account for the fact that the UN had to walk back some of its own numbers recently, and realizing that the actual numbers didn't hold up to what was being witnessed on the actual ground, nor the fact that 2/3 of those numbers are fighters, right? So, and even what we
I don't want to dispute the facts on.
I don't want to go into all of this, but I'm just saying all of this fuels the stuff. If you go around throwing, look, Israel killed 37,000 people, then you're going to rile people up to want to, like, let's go get the Jews. So I think this
but if that number is real, Joshua, then that's still a fact. No, if that number is real, then it's a relevant point. So that
I'm
we
not
can dispute the numbers.
Not, but what I'm saying is, do you see how easy it is to rile people up? And this is the problem.
No doubt.
And I'm not,
that's the basis for my question.
Not trying to be like overly critical or whatever. I'm trying to just point out the fact that it's easy for you, who has zero repercussion. You know, maybe somebody writes you a nasty email of like, I don't like your show, but we have to live with this. When you throw out those kinds of numbers and stuff, then now I get my synagogue spray painted, or the front
Yeah.
doors are, people throw rocks through. And I think this is just the challenge, is that we have to live with all the headlines and stuff, which are not critical. They're meant to sound critical, but the problem is, like you said it earlier, sex sells, or whatever, war sells, right? News agencies are not intended to be unbiased news reporting. They're trying to sell news, right? They're a business. They need commercial money. And so this is just the challenge. And so I just think it's really important that we realize that we need to judge Israel in the same way that we would any other entity, right? And in the same way, like just over the weekend, there were in part of these riots against Israel is that Israel's holding accountable some soldiers who were involved in the mistreatment of some prisoners from Gaza, right? And there were people on the Ben Gvir, this kind of side, including some politicians, that actually invaded and stormed a military base and got into the base. And, there's, so this is a complicated situation. And even within Israel, it's a complicated situation, not just outside, but even inside of Israel.
Yeah. No, a fair point, sir. I'll let Danny ask one quick question to finish
No,
up.
I think part of what's a challenge for Rob and I, and why we're trying to have this conversation, and we're trying to genuinely hear you guys out and learn how to talk about these things, is we also operate in a world that's on the other extreme, where criticism of everything Palestinian, and Genesis 12:3 justifies anything that Israel wants to do. And we get caught in the vortex of those arguments. So when we're there and kind of bring to a place of some kind of legitimate discussion of what does a just peace look like and all of this, then we get caught between these two poles. And so we're talking to you guys to try to learn, what does legitimate criticism of Israel look like? Because we often are in conversations or around people who any criticism of Israel is considered to be anathema.
No, and that's true. And I, just so you guys know, and I know Richard definitely even more so feels this way, is that I get very frustrated often in conversations with Christians, especially because, most of the people that I interact with are going to be on the evangelical side. So they're going to lean more towards the Christian Zionist camp. Actually, it's mixed more and more now that I live on the East Coast, because we have a lot of, especially here in Connecticut. This is the home of Puritanism. So it's mainline churches, or especially the Divinicals and the Divinical school. The seminaries and stuff like that, divinity schools are mainline. So it's much more criticism of Israel and not room for anything positive. So I just want you to know that this is a challenge for me, because in one sense, I'm on one side in this conversation. And on the other side in life, I'm so frustrated that a lot of my Christian friends and colleagues are not critical enough, right? And don't understand that you can be a Zionist and without being anti-Palestinian, right? I got in trouble for saying that even within my own congregation recently. That I think it's important that we, especially as followers of Yeshua, of Jesus, that we're supposed to stand in the gap and be peacemakers.
Exactly.
And that we want to see peace for all peoples, whether Jews, Palestinians, other persecuted minorities. That's our job, and it's not always easy, and especially in a very politicized world in which we live.
Well, thank you so much, guys, for being with us today. Thank you for your time, and again, our love and prayers go to you and for you and for your communities, as well as for peace and for the state of Israel, as well as for the people on the West Bank and Gaza. And
absolutely.
And I think the United States is not doing well on this either, so we'll pray for them. Ukraine is something I've strongly spoken up against as well. And thank you for your time. And of course, we'll meet again probably at the end of the next month and some offline conversations. But so I appreciate your friendships, and I look forward to seeing you guys in November as well. So. Any closing remarks?
Thank you again, Danny and Rob, for having us.
If you feel you're in the middle of these two different groups, you're probably in the right place. You have to
right. No, it's true.
Get walked on.
We want. I think we want to encourage thoughtfulness and intelligent engagement on these issues, and not and that it is, you know, I think Rob gets tired of me. He'll ask me a question. My standard answer on almost any of these issues is, well, it's complicated.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
That's my lead line, because it is. These things are complicated. It's real quick before we go. Do you guys see a hope for peace?
Absolutely.
No.
Do you?
Do I
interesting.
see hope for peace?
Do you see a hope for peace?
I pray for it, and I desperately want it. I'm just so pessimistic at this point of whether it's achievable.
Yeah. Outwardly, it's terrible, and the war, you know, possible escalation in Lebanon and the Houthis.
Right.
Yeah, I know, right.
And the political cycle. But my theology of peace has always got to include a theology of hope.
Yeah.
And I've learned a lot of that from Jürgen Moltmann, who recently passed on, who was there at the end of the Second World War, having realized, you know, his friends dying in front of him in Hamburg and the bombings and everything. And he developed, he knew that Yeshua was the crucified God who died on the cross. And from the ashes of the German post-war reconstruction, he developed a theology of hope. And hope doesn't disappoint us. I know you're a great writer on Revelation and the future, but that has to be grounded in realities. Yes, short term, it's disastrous, but we have to see room for peace and justice and restoration as well.
All right. Again, thank you so much, guys. And if you're watching here, obviously subscribe to the Determined Truth YouTube page, like the page, leave comments. All that helps the algorithm so that people like us that are not sex cells or war cells can actually get views. So thank you again, gentlemen, for your time. And
thanks, guys. Appreciate it so much.
Thanks, guys, for having us.
Yeah.